I have made many a corset these past 2 years, and it is not the cheapest garment to make. And the main reason for that is that you need specific fabrics with specific qualities, and I have never really explored very cheap alternatives to a lot of these materials, but I have often wondered how cheap can I actually make a corset, and will it actually work as intended? Hence this video, where I'm gonna try to attempt to make a corset as cheap as possible. Now, I felt like I needed a specific set of rules for this challenge just to have a framework to work within. So, number 1, fabric from my stash is not free. If I use fabric from my stash, I'll have to estimate a price on it based on what it actually retails as. However, if I use a tablecloth or curtains or something that I already have and that would otherwise be thrown away, I will count that as free. Number 2, I'll strive to use as few specialized tools as possible. And this is because I want this video to help lower the bar for people who want to sew a corset. I'm gonna strive to make it easy. Number 3, I will estimate the cost based on what I actually use and not what I pay for the amount that I buy, if that makes sense. I'm gonna try to not buy in like an unreasonable bulk to lower the price. Number 4, I will not use cheap online stores like Temu or AliExpress and so on to lower the price. Number 5, I'll avoid long distance shipping, and if I have to get it shipped, I'll have to add that to the cost. Number 6, I cannot save money by skipping elements, and I can't use less boning to save money. I have to use the amount that I would actually use if making that corset. So I'm gonna give myself the opportunity to explore different ways of doing things. Rule number 7, I have to use an actual pattern. I'm gonna go for an overbust corset with a front closure and a back closure. So those are my 7 rules that I'm gonna try to stick to. And before I start looking for cheaper supply, I'm gonna go through what I would normally use for a corset and what those things cost. And I've decided to show the cost in dollars and also Norwegian crowns. And I've decided to use a pattern called Freedom Corset by Pinup Girls. I made a spreadsheet, and here is sort of the materials and the price tag for those materials that I would normally spend. These are based on where I would normally buy these items. So the price here may differ from what you would normally buy it for. Just keep that in mind as well. So in total, I would normally spend about $125 on the materials for making this corset. When starting the work on this corset, I was kind of scared that it would be a boring end result. So to spice it up slightly, I decided to add a hip panel, and I also decided to increase the waist reduction, both as a sort of flair, just to make it look a bit more like woo, but also because I wanted to test the strength of the materials. So here are the original pattern pieces, and number 3 to 5 were the pattern pieces that I changed the most. So I divided these at the waistline, and I also took away the extra hip part of the back panel, and I used these to make a hip panel. I also rounded off the edges a bit on the panels next to this. I'm not sure in hindsight if that was necessary, but that was a change that I made at the time. Here is a mock-up that I made with a bunch of scrap material, but note that I didn't do a full mock-up. After finishing it though, I feel like that would have been a good idea, and I'll get back to you on why. Some of the biggest costs here are the front closure, the coutil, and the boning. So I started off by trying to find replacements for these. Now, coutil is expensive for a reason. And it is, in my opinion, without a doubt, the best option for making a corset, and that is because of the high thread count and the way it is woven, which means that it's very strong, it doesn't change shape easily, and it kind of withholds the strain of lacing it up. There are some alternatives that can very well be used if you don't want it to be like super stiff. Cotton twill and cotton duck. And these are often used for workwear, furniture outside and stuff like that. Twill has a diagonal weave. You can sort of see it in the inside of jeans and so on, whereas cotton duck has a more up and down kind of weave. So I spent a lot of time looking for secondhand jeans, secondhand workwear, used boat sails and so on online, but I really didn't find a lot at all, and almost all the jeans that I found had some stretch in it. I decided for a while to use a pair of jeans that I have myself that I thought didn't have stretch in them. I was so convinced that was the case that I actually cut them. It does actually have tiny bit of stretch. I think it was 1% or something, but that's really, it's enough for it to not hold. So what I did was I went to a local thrift store. They had a bin where they'd gathered tablecloths and curtains and kind of like big fabric scraps that people had already cut in, and they just sold those for $1. So I bought this, which I think is a curtain. It's kind of like an upholstery fabric. The fibers are slightly more coarse than I ideally would have liked. I'm not sure if this is a natural fiber, which means that it will be less comfortable to wear. $1. So I'm gonna try to calculate exactly how much of this fabric I end up using. Usually it's a meter. And for the outer fabric, I stumbled upon something I'd totally forgotten about. We got bed sheets as a present at some point, and they came in these fabric bags. It's the same material as the bed sheets. I figured that if I took these apart and ironed them out, they could amount to quite a lot of fabric, and just came sort of for free with the bed sheets. So at this point, I'd started sketching out my idea for the design of the corset. So I imagined having these as the vertical panels and having denim for the hip panel. But after testing this material a bit, I found that I would have to add more of the denim. I had planned on using a discarded pair of my husband's jeans for the hip panel, and I would take the panels above the hip panel in the denim as well, just to give it a bit more cohesion and make it look deliberate. I also realized I needed some interfacing for both the striped fabric and the jean fabric, so I just ironed that on before cutting. And here are all the pieces laid out, and I could start putting it together. I have made a test where I just quilted a layer of really cheap poly something padding to the back of the used jeans. So I'm gonna continue doing that, and I want to use a white thread for the padding just to kind of bind it all together and give it a bit of contrast. Now, as you can see here, I did make some markings on the hip panels just to make sure that I stayed on the same angle, and then I just spent hours doing the quilting before overlocking around the panels. And after that, I could move on to sewing the panels themselves together. And I just started with the front and moved gradually towards the back. And then I made sure to just clip the seam allowances thoroughly before giving it a good press. And then I just pinned on the hip panel to the sort of opening over the hip and sewed that on. And this was a struggle, so I don't really have good footage of this, but I just sewed around the whole thing. And I feel like this is a good time to point out that I used two different sewing methods for the different sides of the corset, and I have a very specific preference here. For the first side, I just press the seams open, and also when sewing on the hip panel, I press those seams open. For the other side, I press them towards the back, and also for the hip panel, I press that towards the hip. And the latter was without a doubt best. I feel like when pressing the seams towards the side, it's stronger in the joint between the panels. And also when pressing the hip panel seam allowance down, I didn't have the seam allowance poking up in between the layers to interfere with the boning later on. I have just sewn on some scrap fabric onto the front, and that is just because when embroidering this, I want a larger surface to fit into the frame. But before I'm gonna do that, I will top stitch the seams, and I'm gonna do it with white overall, and then I'm gonna do the embroidery. I've just sketched it out on the back here, and I'm gonna do lighter flowers here and darker flowers here just to make sure that they show up. And here is what the outer fabric looks like after top stitching. So then I moved on to the embroidery that I had sketched out. I used this muted dark green for the stem, and I had a dark blue and a more light cold green for the flowers. And I just use a regular backstitch for the stem here. I listen to a lot of audiobooks when doing this part of the process. And I'm not sponsored by Audible, but do contact me if you feel so inclined. So with that, I'm not done with the stalks. Is it stalks? Do correct me if I'm mistaken. I'm gonna add some lighter flowers on this side with a darker fabric and darker flowers on the lighter fabric. When I've done that, I'm gonna start with the lining, I think. Here are the two sides finished. I was really happy with how the embroidery turned out, and I like the combination of colors here. Here are all the pattern pieces for the linings. I'm just gonna sew these together, and when that is done, I can start assembling the lining to the outer material. So I'm just gonna sew this together off camera. I have pinned the lining and the outer layer together. So I'm just gonna sew down the center back here somewhere and the center front, and then I'm going to turn it out and try to just stitch in the ditch in between the panels. I'm going to do boning channels between each panel, and I've also just sketched on boning channels in between the seams as well. It's kind of unfortunate that I'll have to sew over the embroidery, but I feel like this is the cheapest way to do it, to put it between the two layers. So that's what I'm going to do. And here I'm just sewing with like a stitch in the ditch method, where I am sewing the two outer fabric and lining together along the seams. And as I mentioned, it does interfere a bit with the embroidery, but I don't think it's so bad that it really irks me. For the boning, I have bought something I've seen that people use as a cheap option. I've never tried it myself, and that is zip ties. These are the biggest one I was able to find anywhere, almost 9 millimeters wide. So these are just plastic. There are plastic boning alternatives available, synthetic whalebone. It is something called extruded polyester, and there is something about the way it is made that makes it more durable than plastic and stronger than plastic. This folds very easily without me putting a lot of pressure on it. So I bought a packet of 100 of these. That's the cheapest alternative. So I also want to touch on the topic of sustainability here, because using this as boning I think will shorten the lifespan of the garment, which is not very sustainable. And also I found that since these are finished lengths, I got a lot of spare plastic lengths that I couldn't really use for anything. They were a bit hard to round off by sort of sanding them and filing them down. I just kind of chipped away at them with a knife, and this created a lot of like minuscule plastic pieces that also I didn't feel good about. I'm a bit worried. I did discover this earlier, but I kind of let it slide. The lining fabric is slightly more slack. It's not tight when I'm tightening the corset. I'm scared that when I tighten it, one of two things will happen. It will crease, or, which is worse, the outer fabric might tear. Why this has happened, I'm not entirely sure. It might be because the outer fabric has interfacing, which maybe has made it more stable, and maybe the weave of the inner fabric is looser than I kind of thought it was, meaning that it stretches more easily. At this point, I feel like it's too late to do anything about it. I'm gonna finish it as is, but it's a concern. I'm gonna continue with the eyelets. So I'm just using an awl to make the holes and then just sewing around the opening. And again, this was really time consuming. If I were to put metal eyelets in, I would have probably spent an hour or two, whereas here I spent several days. So I like the effect, I think it's really beautiful, and they are strong and it works really well, but it is time consuming. Now in terms of the front closure, because now I'm done with the back, I have made all the handmade eyelets and I'm really happy with them. I think they're very even. I'm gonna do the same for the front. I don't really feel like anything can replace a busk in terms of a front closure. You can get really sturdy zippers that you can use instead, and that is kind of in terms of practicality similar, but it wouldn't be as inexpensive. So all I really need for this is my awl and needle and thread. So it will interfere a bit with the embroidery, I can tell, but I'm gonna try to place it as inconspicuous as possible. So after putting in all of these hand-sewn eyelets, I'm gonna start with the binding. So I've just bought binding for this because it's not really cheap, or I feel, to make my own. And buying binding I find is fairly inexpensive. So I just have this dark blue cotton binding. I'm just gonna sew it on to the back first, fold it over, and then just top stitch the front. All the binding is on. All that really remains now is to lace it up and try it on. So hopefully it's gonna fit. I'm worried about two things. One, that it'll somehow rip. The other thing I'm slightly worried about is how this will lay over the hip. I'm scared it's gonna wrinkle like this. I think it's in part the pattern changes that maybe didn't go right as planned, but I'm gonna lace it up, and I'm gonna use this cotton cord that I bought in bulk, not like a huge amount, but I bought a bit more than I otherwise would, just to lower the price a bit. And I've just put on some tape on the end here just to make it easier to get it through the holes. So it didn't rip. Mostly, I feel like it fits. Now, before moving on to the proper finished look video, I just want to go over the overall price of making this corset. So I have another spreadsheet for you guys. So feast your eyes on this. The first columns are what I showed you guys before with the overall price. I also have the changes that I made, price of the new materials, and what I saved. So the total price for this new corset is $7.40 or 84 Norwegian crowns. That is $118 less than I would normally spend on the materials for making this corset. Now, does that mean I will start making corsets with these materials instead? No. I think coutil is worth it in terms of making corsets that will be stiff enough and hold up and just last longer. I also think that steel boning is worth it, but I think it's hard to replace flat steel boning, particularly for the back. And also spiral steel is so great for just like curved seams. I might use the lining material here for mock-ups and also the boning for mock-up. So I think that is the big takeaway from this project for me, because for a mock-up, then I can just take them out and reuse them for a new mock-up and so on. And when it comes to the busk, I think it's hard pressed to find anything that can really replace a busk. A combination of the strength and the practicality of that front closure, and these are not that expensive to begin with. Now, that being said, let's take a look at this super cheap corset in action. You can see that it does what I was kind of scared it would, which is crease here. It is straining a bit here. When you don't have a very stiff metal in the front, it does kind of go out again like this. But that's especially because I've tightened it so much around the waistline. It is gaping slightly, I think, in the back. Other than that, it's looking a lot better than I was scared it would. So I hope you guys had fun following me on this project. I hope it was a learning experience for you guys as it was for me. And if you like this video, please consider leaving a like below. That is super helpful. And if you want to see more videos like this, consider subscribing. That is free and you can always change your mind. And I hope to see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.